We're used to thinking about the state or the government as a given. But in fact, what we think of as a modern nation state is a relatively recent phenomenon. Max Weber's classic definition is that a state has a monopoly over the legitimate use of physical force in a defined geographical territory. But each of these terms could use some unpacking. The meaning of legitimacy in legitimate use of physical force is so interesting and so provocative that I want to pick it up in the discussion forums, particularly in reference to the Tilly article. The geographical territory in question is generally called the country. And we still retain a little bit of that original meaning. That country, that territory, will have clear geographical boundaries. That seems obvious to us, so obvious that it seems silly that I even mention it. But it has not always been true. Here's a fairly detailed map of Scandinavia from the 1500s. There are a lot of details, but you really can't tell where one country ends and another begins. A small part of the reason for this is that modern surveying techniques and certainly satellite photography didn't exist. But it's more than just a phenomenon of maps. It really was not of any particular concern where the exact boundaries were between one country and another. Nation traditionally referred to an ethnic, linguistic, or cultural group. And again, we still have retained much of the original sense of the word. Here's a definition that captures most of the way we usually think of a nation. The totality of people united by a common fate so that they possess a common national character, a common national history, and a common language. And this is crucially important, as you know, in modern politics, we now assume that a group of people who are united by that common culture should have their own rightful homeland. My personal favorite definition: a nation is a group of persons united by a common error, a common mistake about their ancestry, and a common hatred, a common dislike of their neighbors. This sarcastic definition actually gets at something very profound. It's almost always the case that nations have simplified or even falsified parts of their history in order to construct a narrative. Here's an example that's pretty benign, but it illustrates this principle. Scottish nationalists wear tartan plaid kilts. You've probably seen these kilts. They wear them in honor of their ancient Scottish customs. There's a movement among some Scottish to separate from the UK, and many of those people see these tartan kilts as a symbol of Scottish history and independence. But that ancient custom was actually created, invented fairly recently. If you happen to have seen the movie Braveheart, you'll know that Mel Gibson wears plaid Scottish kilts. But this movie was set in 1300, so the historical character would not have done that. The fact that we expect these three concepts, nation, state, and country, that we expect to find them all together, is very significant. The people in that territory, ruled by that sovereign state, will see themselves as having a common identity. And that's actually very new. So how did this creation of a national identity through reinterpretation or invention of history, how did it occur? Let's look at some small changes that both indicate and furthered the growth of nationalism, partly through the invention of common rituals. For virtually all countries, things like national anthems, almost all of them were written or at least selected in the 1700s or 1800s or even later. There had always been holidays, but typically in Catholic Europe, for example, these were religious days, saints' days. Only with the invention of the nation, nationalism, the nation state, that the idea of these secular holidays, which typically celebrated something about the nation, were invented. When I was growing up, Webster's dictionary was in every schoolroom and most homes. The reason Noah Webster originally created his American spelling book was explicitly to promote the idea that American culture was different from, was distinct from, was just as good as British culture.
The increasing complexity of society created a need for more widespread education.
Mass primary education went hand in hand with inculcating, with teaching people that they were part of a particular nation, that they should love that country, and that they should obey that country's laws. Now,
why else do we learn these kinds of friendly myths about the founding fathers and about our country's history?
Government themselves expect that all citizens in a given nation state will be subject to the same set of laws that'll be directly administered by the central government, and that we all, the citizens of that state, are expected to be loyal to that authority, that nation, and have no loyalty whatsoever to any external authority and community. We take all of that for granted, but again, that has not always been the case. None of those things would have been true for people living in the Middle Ages in Europe and in some of Asia. Feudal society, one was expected to have due loyalty to religious authorities, to one's own local lord, and to a king who had some loose amount of fealty, some loose amount of control and authority. In the 1500s, for example, states certainly existed, although they weren't nation states in the sense that we think of them today. But they were one form of political authority amongst many. City-states. There were many leagues of loosely affiliated territories. And amongst the most important political actors were supranational, that is, they were much larger than the national level, religious authorities, with the obvious example being the Holy Roman Empire. Sometimes our modern system, where the world is divided up into nation states, is referred to as the Westphalian system. That's because it was a peace treaty signed at Westphalia in 1648, which both reflected a pre-existing balance of power, and it furthered and it formalized the division of the world into nation states. We now understand that the Treaty of Westphalia was just one important stop on the road to the modern state system and the modern nation state. It is also a somewhat Eurocentric assumption to see Westphalia as being the change. Just to give one interesting example, China had a centralized Confucian bureaucracy more than 1,000 years earlier.
But in this specific case, added attention to Europe may be warranted.
In the process of colonizing 4/5 of the world, Europe exported its model of a nation state